Hello, squad. How are we doing? Right, I'm trying my best today. I'm trying my best. Just been speaking with producer Jacob about, I should have been in the studio twice already this year. What are we on? The 18th of Jan, Wednesday, 2023. But this is the third time I've been ill in Jan. I don't really get ill. It's because of Thea. The little maggot is passing on her illnesses to myself and to Jess. Jess has gotten away with it this time, actually, but I couldn't not show up for the third week on the trot in Jan. So here we are. First one back. First podcast of 2023. I think, it's quite tempting, and I think you might be expecting to hear New Year's resolutions, that type of thing. To be honest, until this second, that didn't pop into my head, which I think is a good thing, because it's absolutely not something that, it's not that I'm not behind it. It's great to give yourself promises. And I don't want to get too much into no, you know what? Let's do that. I'm going to make a note of it. We'll go into the topics of New Year's resolutions and why they don't work in terms of their psychology. Awesome. So let's do that. But what I'll also do is every week I will jump into the Facebook group. I'll jump into the Bobby Nutrition community and ask questions. And that's what we have today. So the headline topics for today's, I think we'll take about 45 minutes or so. And we are going to talk about how you can be nice and forgive yourself. So how you can be nice to yourself and forgive yourself. We are going to talk about guilt with old habits. So what that means is when old shit keeps coming up and you find yourself repeating old patterns, how can you manage the associations that you have with what's going on? How we can reframe our perspective of ourselves when we're looking in the mirror and we have a very negative connotation with that experience. And if we have time, how you can be more patient as well. And I think when it comes to being more patient, I think actually I said, let's see if we have some time, but let's kind of loop that into the whole New Year's resolutions topic, because I think everybody who is listening to this will be after some form of either weight loss or some form of personal growth, or both. We all love a resolution. We can reframe it into different words. We can say, well, let's call it something different this year. Let's call it like a promise to ourselves. And that can help. But I don't know if there is such data that exists, but if I'm talking, to you guys, I would argue that the vast majority of you, 90+%, if not all of you, have, if not this year, in the past, you've put a resolution in place and it hasn't lasted. Either through the first weeks, first months, or even 4 or 5 years down the line, life's caught up with you and old habits start creeping up. And we can feel very guilty about this. You're only human, for God's sake. But why can't we be strong enough? Why can't we be motivated enough to keep that consistency? Even when we see results, whatever they may be, we often seem to sabotage those results. Why the fuck do we do this to ourselves? So, if we think about our brain, for the sake of this conversation, is split into two. So we have our emotional brain We can call this our subconscious. We can get all sciencey and call it our amygdala. And we have our prefrontal cortex, which is the sciencey stuff, for our logical thinking. Now, on the surface of it, I think we all like to believe that we're incredibly logical. So I think from the sounds of how I've described it, we believe that at least as adults, everything that we do kind of sits in that latter part of the brain that I described. And yes, we are analytical, and we're certainly more calculated and forward thinking than we were when we were like 6 years old. However, we're still just monkeys at the end of the day. So we're not that fantastic. We're not as fantastic as we think we are. So whenever we're talking about something like motivation or a New Year's resolution, that New Year's resolution is a logical decision. And here's the problem. It's a logical solution to an emotional problem. So the reason that you have all of these sabotaging tendencies and you've never been able to put your finger on it, and you try diet after diet after diet, program after program, coach after coach, and nothing ever seems to do the job, is because everything that is driving why you can't do that thing is in your subconscious mind. It's emotional, it's habitual. So this emotional mind, or this emotional sector of our mind, that's responsible for 90 to 95% of our daily brain activity. Whereas this logical brain, where we think we all sit as adults, is the 5 to 10%. Simple maths. You tell me which of those two is going to win the battle. So that subconscious mind, that 95% mind, is holding years and years and years of comfort. Even if that comfort brings us pain and poor health, it still brings us comfort. And from a survival mechanism perspective, that's what we're programmed to do, survive. That's it. Whereas, if you put a New Year's resolution in place that says, I'm going to walk 10,000 steps a day because 10,000 is a magical number, if I'm going to eat X amount of calories per day, if I'm going to whatever, jump on this diet, jump on that diet, whatever it might be, that is a logical choice. That is a logical solution, rather, to years of what is subconsciously driven and managed in the 95% mind. So what you are doing there without realizing when you put a resolution in place is you're trying to use the power of the 5% mind and try to get that to overpower what's happening in the 95% mind. It doesn't stand a fucking chance. It does in certain circumstances because you can be motivated. And if you're motivated for a consistent period of time, which most people won't be because life happens. And then depending on the individual, if we associate guilt with certain experiences quite prominently, then we're more likely to give up, et cetera, et cetera. That all depends on the individual. But for the majority of people, you can't be motivated the majority of the time. You just can't, for the reasons that I just described. And that is why New Year's resolutions typically do not last. Because we're not considering the association that we have with work. All we're considering is whether we believe we're going to be able to count calories or not. We're not considering our association with the stress of parenting. We're only considering the amount of steps that we're going to walk. It's useful to have the logical information, because these are the action steps that you might need to take. But if you don't consider, not just consider, if you don't prioritize and understand the subconscious thought patterns and therefore actions that have been actually holding you back for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, you're going to keep winding yourself back in the same position again. And that's not because you're lazy, which is what most people would tell you. It depends on the amount of trauma that's carried within that subconscious. It depends on your past. It depends on your story. But if this is reaching the type of person that I need it to reach, chances are you carry more trauma than most people. And that means a New Year's resolution probably statistically just ain't gonna cut it. You have to dive in to what is sat in that 95% mind so you can unravel it piece by piece. So that's why New Year's resolutions haven't worked for you so far. Cool. And wait, producer Jacob, do you have any New Year's resolutions?
I do actually.
Yeah?
I never take like lunch breaks, or I just work all day. So I've been going for like little 20-minute walks in the middle of the day, just around town. Just no music, no nothing.
That's a nice little promise to yourself.
But I make my New Year's resolutions in December, so I get a month ahead.
Right. There you go. There's a trick. You heard it here first. Are you sticking to it?
I am.
Oh, nice, man. Well done. Well done. So I think that's a good point, is that sounds kind of obvious, but how realistic the resolution is always going to make a difference as well. So the expectations that you set of yourself are always going to make, because I'm talking about how motivation isn't going to be enough. But if you're realistic with it, you don't require a hell of a lot of motivation to do it, because the benefit far outweighs, the difficulty that it's going to bring you. What most people do is that they set that it's almost like it's like a perfect correlation. The amount of pain that you feel, it equates directly to how severe the solution is that you put in place, because you're so excited about it. You're like, this is it, I'm gonna do it. So it's almost like a perfect balancing act. But the problem with that is that, as you will have found, it's difficult to keep consistent to that. If, like producer Jacob, you can put something as simple as, instead of working through the day, let me guess, you kind of have to force yourself away from the desk. Yeah, of course you do. Because what will keep you attached to the desk, it's not the logic of, well, if I stay at this desk, I'm going to get X, Y, and Z done. What's actually happening is, subconsciously, it's more of, well, how I'm going to feel terrible about myself if I don't stay at this desk. And then the guilt comes, and then you can talk yourself into staying, and before you know it, the day's over and you haven't left the building. So yeah, so you have to, there's always going to be a little bit of motivation and so-called discipline required. So if you are going to put something in place, you have to have, as many people will tell you, you have to have a really good why behind why you're going to put that in place. Cool. Awesome. Have I put any promises in place this year? I did. Let me get my 2023s up. So what did I call them? I called them intentions. So my 2023 intentions to myself. So 1, less forward thinking about people's interpretations or feelings. So it's kind of like a good superpower that I have. And whilst I don't like the word, a lot of so-called empaths have this. You're very good at reading the room. And this, to be able to understand how people are feeling and thinking when they might not even be aware of it, is a very, very handy tool to have in your toolbox, but it can be crippling as well. And you've got to know when to use it, and also when it's holding you back. Because if you're constantly maneuvering your day around how other people are feeling, well, it completely undermines my entire value, which is that you can't manage other people's emotions. A big one for the entire Bobby Nutrition team this year, actually, is something around do less tasks, but make sure you focus on that less more. So 2022, it kind of had to be with where the business was and where my personal life was. It was very much a year of doing. And there is a time in your life where you kind of have to do that. But there then has to be a point where you say, okay, what can I delegate? What can I leave behind? What no longer serves me? How can I be more efficient with my time? Because I don't shy away from it, and I'm not ashamed of it, in that my family is always going to be my number one priority. So most people in year 2 and 3 of business, they're still working till midnight every night. If it means that I'm not going to be as successful in business by not doing so, I don't particularly care, because that's not what I value anyway. So I have a relatively strict cutoff point of around 6 p.m. every night. That doesn't happen all the time. Just like you're going to get things wrong that you commit to. But it's an intention that I'm setting myself, is to do less tasks better. Cold exposure 3 times a week. So I got myself the Lumi pod. If you follow my Instagram stories, you'll see me, stroking my ego by only sharing it on the gram. If it doesn't happen on the gram, it doesn't happen at all. So have I been sticking to that? Yeah, I think so. Like, me and producer Jacob were talking about this before, as well as like coming to this space. Like, when you come to a space, you're going to commit yourself to it, as opposed to doing everything at home. So a lot of people take the piss out of people with a Lumi pod. A Lumi pod is it's just good marketing. It's a fucking kiddie's pool sucked up into a slightly taller model so that an adult can fit in it, and you just put cold water in it. So it's literally just a bath. Producer Jacob's got it on the screen now. Yeah, exactly. So I've got one of them. Can people see that? Oh, sweet. So it's one of those. And you just blow it up. It's like 99 quid. Well, that one's 175, but yeah, the one that I got wasn't that much. But this is the thing, because that Lumi pod is dedicated to that task, I'm almost excited to do it, because I'm dedicating myself, I'm committing myself to an intention and a promise that I've made to myself. So yeah, logically, you could say, fill up the bloody bath, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not. Maybe you will. Maybe you're a better person than I am. But if you can give yourself an environment that is specific to that task, James Clear talks about this a lot in his book Atomic Habits as well. Dedicate an environment to the task, and then unconsciously you will associate that environment with the task. So cold exposure. I can talk at some point about why I do cold exposure. A lot of people do it for so-called health benefits. Having come from an evidence and science-based background with nutrition, I am very wary about the so-called science that a lot of cold exposure enthusiasts rely on. Because what they will say is, there is science that stipulates that this is healthy in terms of X, Y, and Z. And that might be the case. But the reality is that based on the evidence available so far, we can't possibly conclude that. So those things might be true, but we can't say it fundamentally. We're not at that point yet. It will take a number of years and a lot more data gathering. Mother's calling me. Let's put her on. Hello?
Oh, hi, Bob. You okay?
I am. I'm literally just recording a podcast at the moment, Mum, which you're currently live on. Can I call you back later?
Of course. Just to death.
All right, speak to you in a bit.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
She's too scared.
God bless Norma. Bless Norma. We all love Norma. Yeah. So yes. So the science of cold exposure. It's not fantastic at the moment. So it might be true, and when we collect more, the conclusion that we're able to make through more meta-analyses and what have you, cool. But I just do it because it's hard. That's the only reason that I do it personally. Sunday date nights. So Jess and I have realized that television's awesome. But that's kind of all we end up doing after, a hard day's work, let's say. And that's absolutely fine. I'm okay with that. But, you have to, I believe you have to ensure that you keep on top of connecting with your other half. Talk about your day, how you actually feeling at the moment. I don't think many couples actually ask each other that fundamental question. How are you actually feeling at the moment? Like, not that I'm a relationship expert, but I am good at understanding people and I'm good at understanding myself. And I know it goes a long way that if somebody takes the time to genuinely ask, especially when Jess does it, if she asks me, how are you actually feeling? It's quite overwhelming to have that kind of space and an understanding from somebody else. So Sunday date night, we are committing to, that type of conversation at least once a week on a Sunday. And then daily journaling, because journaling completely fell off I love journaling. It's the one thing that I committed to most when I got through sobriety and turned into this better version of myself. But it really fell off towards the back end of last year, just because of where the business was and things like that. And that doesn't make it okay. I very much fell into a case of doing too much and feeling a lot less. Exactly what I, warned you guys about. But I've caught myself, and now I'm making sure that I have the space to journal more, implement my breath work more. Because self-care certainly fell away. Now, that might sound like quite a big list, and I would argue that maybe for a lot of you guys, that is way too much. Because if you're doing fuck all at the moment and your entire life has been based around serving everyone else, taking the kids to school, getting their dinner ready, going to work, getting back from work, cooking everyone dinner, that stuff is too much. The only reason that I can do all of that is because I have spent years trialing and erroring where I should put this, where I should put that, whether that works for me, whether that doesn't work for me. So that's the reason that I can try so many things at once. It's not what I would recommend to somebody trying to, just put a simple resolution in place. Just put something simple in place, because relative to me, that stuff is really simple. Cold exposure is just okay. Because I've been trying to get into cold showers and cold exposure properly for, I think, like 4 years now. And it's only just really sticking. That's how long it's taken me. I would do it for like a couple of weeks and then it would kind of fall off or what have you. So take all of that with a pinch of salt. Right. Diving in to what people are asking. So let's jump into the group. By the way, remember, if you want to have the opportunity to ask these types of questions, the only way you're going to do so is by joining the community. So make sure that you go to Facebook. I've plugged it today on my stories. You can just click the Bobby Nutrition community link and join us there. If you have recently requested access, I can see there's quite a big list. Don't worry, you're going to be approved. We just have to go through, there's a backlog because it's January. So let's start at the top. So this one is from Mina. So I know Mina very well. Mina was actually a client. She worked with Coach Rose on a one-to-one basis. So Mina Darlov asks, I think you should talk about being nice and forgiving to yourself, and how profoundly it will change your life. Cool. So how can we be nice to ourselves? How can we forgive ourselves? And I think this opens up the big misunderstanding as to not the self-development world, because I do think a lot of the self-development industry is full of too many niceties, which just stroke the ego and don't actually implement any change. relative to the approach that we might take at Bobby Nutrition. So I'll start off by saying what a lot of the self-development industry do think it is and what I don't think it is. And that is, standing in front of a mirror, naked, with like crazy face paint on, saying how fucking phenomenal, saying how, bloody great that you are. Cool. Yeah, it's not just saying how wonderful you are, because in that moment, that's not what you believe. Now, we can call these affirmations, and we have jokes internally in Bobby Nutrition, because a lot of the team, a lot of the coaching staff, team excellence, as head coach Emma refers to them as, very much, a lot of those guys love an affirmation. And I don't include affirmations as part of my journaling, but there isn't a time and a place. There is a time and a place for them, rather. But at the start of your journey, I don't believe so. They might add some value because they might represent this new idea of something that you're committing to yourself. But they're not enough to undermine how your mind works. Maybe over time, if you're really consistent and you're doing it over and over and over and over again, okay, sure. But for me, that's quite a long-winded way of doing it until that change in your mind is genuinely going to happen. And the longer something takes, well, the more time there is for stuff to go wrong in that time. So the first thing I would say is that it's not just saying nice things to yourself. It can be reframing things and then using your logical mind to call, because you could say, I've eaten this chocolate, I am a shit human being, and I hate myself for it. We can all agree, if we step outside the emotional brain that is giving us that nonsense, that is bullshit. We can all agree on that. But it doesn't change how we feel in that moment, because it's driven by our emotional brain. That will always come first. However, we can engage our logical brain to talk ourselves down. We can try to use as many facts as we can to contradict the bullshit that we're telling ourselves. So that's one thing that we can do. Easier said than done. But at least then you're going through a step-by-step process to gather evidence to contradict the so-called evidence that your emotional brain has at the start of that exercise. And that's what I would call firm compassion. Whereas before, this, you're wonderful, you're actually great, that's just kind of like fake compassion to me. You don't believe it. Whereas if you can have this firm compassion, it's holding yourself brutally accountable to the fact that, you know what, this just isn't fucking true. I feel it is, but I'm going to go through this process as a commitment to myself, just as though another person would. This is what sometimes your friends can do. And that can help as well, but it's important that you act as your own friend, act as your own third party, to hold those negative thoughts accountable. And finally, on that point, why do we do it? Why do we struggle to forgive ourselves if we eat a piece of chocolate or whatever it might be? It's easier. It's just easier. So you can use that to call yourself out as well. The blood will always flow to our emotional brain first, because that's how we're designed. So if our instinct is to just feel really shit about ourselves after getting something wrong, we're going to continue to feel guilt after getting something wrong. But if we're able to understand what all of these things are, all of these triggers, that means that we've got more chance of developing a deeper sense of awareness of those things. If we have a deeper sense of awareness of those things, we can call ourselves out on those things. And then once we call ourselves out more and more and more, our brain will say, hold on, we normally feel guilty. We normally feel really bad about ourselves, but this bugger, this person here is really fighting us every time this happens. So that's taken a lot of energy. Maybe we need to move this part into the subconscious way of thinking because that's going to require less energy. We don't like using energy. And then once we make that our natural way of thinking, well, the rest is history, as they say. Question 1. Question 2 is from Laura Thomas. So Laura has said, I would love to hear about the guilt associated to returning to old habits. Specifically, she said about gaining weight back after losing it. How many of you are familiar with that experience? But first of all, let me answer that by selfishly talking about my own experiences, because I answered a question similar to this in the Q&A that we had with all the clients last week. And I remember when I was first kind of on a good run in sobriety. And I didn't relapse after this, but what I was doing was I would find journaling, and I would find walking in nature, and I would find all of these new amazing replacements for drinking. And whilst that's good, it's much better anyway, what I would find is that anytime I wasn't doing those things, the guilt that I would feel would be insurmountable, because my brain was essentially saying, oh, okay, so you're lazy again, are you? You're back to old Rob again, are you? And that's what our mind's supposed to do. It's going to take it back to the way we've always thought, until we spent a good period of time consciously moving away from it. So a big period of my recovery and my sobriety was, dare I say it, a relatively unhealthy relationship with self-development and improving myself. But it had to be, because it was either that or drinking. And anybody, whether you're going through recovery or whether you are trying to just reduce the amount of, saturated fat or chocolate that you're eating, you're going to have to go through that interim period. But the reality is that, linking this back to the question, whenever we feel like we're stepping back into a version of ourselves that we have tried so fucking hard to move away from, it's going to come with guilt and shame, because that's all that life was associated with. That's why we made the choices that we did at that point, because the only way that we could cope with that guilt and shame was to use the coping mechanisms that you will have chosen. If you're watching this, it was probably food. For me, it was alcohol. So it's completely natural to feel guilt if you are showing signs of, not showing signs, if there was any unconscious reminder, the subtlest of reminders, even if it's the same environment or a person that you might associate with that previous life, that previous identity that you've worked so hard to move away from, it's going to come back. But it's just a feeling. It's just a feeling. It's not real. It's a real feeling, but it's not objective truth and fact. So I think my point, the way that I would manage this question is, Laura's asking here, what about when we put all that weight back on? My point is that, okay, well, you've put all the weight back on, but take a step back. You have the guilt now. What we've got to do is manage that guilt whenever you step into that environment that reminds you of your previous self. Right now, if you have already put the weight back on, that might mean every time that you look in the mirror, that's the reminder. But let's loop back to the exercise that I took you guys through a second ago in Mina's question. You can use your logical mind to contradict the belief that you hold towards yourself. It's just a belief. It's not fact. It's not objective truth. Unconsciously, your brain will always resort to a belief and an emotion. It will always resort to that. Imagine having a Muslim person and a Catholic person on either end of this table here, and it's a debate. The Muslim is trying to convert the Catholic and vice versa. Either of them can use as much logic as they want, but it's a tough job getting one to convert because it's a belief. But that doesn't mean either of them is speaking facts. They're their facts, but that doesn't mean they're speaking fact. Fact is fact. So it's your job to almost act as though these two individuals would be and do it over and over and over again. Keep knocking this. I'm not keeping this frame here next time. Keep knocking it. It's your job to referee yourself out of the guilt that's coming. What else have I got here? Oh yeah, second of all, same as the previous question, it's easier to feel guilty because you always have. You're going to feel guilty. The issue that we have here is that whenever you feel guilt, you have a go-to because guilt is a so-called negative emotion. So maybe what we need to think about here is letting that emotion in just a little bit more. If you're avoiding guilt, I'd imagine somebody listening to this or watching this uses food to manage that negative emotion. Next time, let the guilt in. You might not have let it get to that point. What is this guilt? When you question this guilt more and more and you take it further and further and further back, and this is really where you need support, to be completely honest. This is very, very difficult to do with to yourself. Especially when you've never had any training in it. But what we need to do is reverse and reverse and reverse and reverse it until we get to a point where you are finally able to see that this guilt that you feel, you're not the person that planted that guilt seed. It came from somebody else. That is a certainty. You weren't born with guilt. It's not, whilst guilt is part of the human condition, all feelings are part of the human condition. What we feel guilt over is learned. It has to be. Once you're able to connect those dots and then understand where did that guilt come from, well then, every time that you feel that guilt, it's an extra bit of logical ammunition that you can use to hold that emotional brain accountable to the bullshit that it's trying to tell you. And finally, guilt comes from expectations of ourselves. If we didn't have an expectation of ourselves and we failed against reaching that so-called expectation, we wouldn't feel guilty. I've had many conversations around this, whether it be internally or with the hundreds of clients that we've worked with. I know you might have set those expectations of yourself, but those expectations unconsciously will have come from somewhere else. More often than not, it's who we were brought up by. That shouldn't really be a surprise. When mum and dad put astounding pressure on us to perform, and we're brought up in a household that is driven by results, what that tells a child is that they are only worth anything if they get those results. So then we take that into adulthood, feeling that we're never going to be worth anything unless we're constantly getting results. And this is what we can call this perfectionism. So that's just one example of where expectations are set. So yes, as an adult, you might have these so-called expectations of yourselves, and then when you don't meet them, you feel awful about yourself. But empower yourself by questioning where those expectations came from to begin with. One of my mottos is no expectations. And, I don't always live by that. I try to, but, sometimes I can get, I can just have one of those days where shit hasn't gone my way, and therefore I'm not thinking as objectively as I would normally like to. And before I know it, I'm lacking a lot of compassion for myself because I didn't complete, a load of tasks on time. When the reality is that if I'm able to step back from that, nobody fucking noticed that I didn't do them, apart from me, because of the expectations that I have of myself. So pretty good motto is to have no expectations of yourself, and instead live through certain values that you hold, find good values that are worth living through, and then just live through the behaviors, any positive behaviors that can be associated with those values, as opposed to doing everything for an outcome or an expectation. Because I don't know how many more examples we need to prove that when we get to an outcome, we might be happy when we get to that outcome, but that feeling doesn't last. I had this conversation with Jess the other day. I'll finish with this. I had this conversation with Jess the other day, and we sat down and we said, do you remember when we lived in the flat in New Ferry? For those who don't know, New Ferry isn't the best of areas. And we lived in that flat together for a little while whilst I was building the business. And hand on heart, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe me, but hand on heart, I feel, as does Jess, even though now the business has quadrupled, the coaching staff has more than quintupled. I don't know what the word would be. Things have gotten better on paper. Let me put it that way. Do I feel any different? I hand on heart don't. It's nice to have a bit more freedom and things like that. But that's what it really comes down to, the freedom relative to before. All in all, both Jess and I, because we were so happy before, because it sounds so cheesy, but as long as we had each other and we had Louis, Thea wasn't in the picture at the time, we were good. We were good. Everything after that is kind of like a tag along, And I think it's important that we're always improving, but that's the point. It's not about reaching these so-called expectations and reaching these so-called goals. I think a lot of you will have found that even when you've reached your weight loss goal, you've put the weight back on. That's because the reasons that you were using to fuel that process were driven by shame, as opposed to understanding and focusing on your, everything else that we've discussed today. So, yeah. So, as always, team, we're on YouTube now. So I'm going to push the YouTube channel more and more and more. So if you like this, go for it. Give it a follow. Give it a subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, follow, like, comment, all the rest. And I'll catch up with you next week.